Chapter 44. She came toward us in the lamplight, toward the table in the southeast corner of the upstairs terrace. It was the antithesis of her first entrance there, the night I had formerly met her as Lily. She wore almost the same clothes as that afternoon, the same white trousers, though she had changed into a white shirt, slightly loose-sleeved, as some sort of concession to evening formality. A coral necklace, the red belt and espadrilles, a hint of eyeshadow, a touch of lipstick. Conscious and I stood for her. She hesitated in front of me, then gave me a charged look, faintly desperate, staring. "I feel awful about this afternoon. Will you please forgive me?" "Forget it. It was nothing." She glanced then at Conchis, as if to see whether she had his approval. He smiled, indicated the chair between us, but she reached where her white shirt was buttoned and held out a sprig of jasmine. "A peace offering." I smelt it. "That's sweet of you." She sat. Conchis poured her a cup of coffee, while I offered her a cigarette and then lit it. She seemed chastened and carefully avoided my eyes after that first look. Conchis said, "Nicholas and I have been discussing religion." It was true. He had brought a Bible to the table, with 2 reference slips in it, and we had got on to God and no God. "Oh." She stared down at her coffee, then raised the cup and sipped, but at the same time I felt a minute pressure on my foot under the long tablecloth. "Nicholas calls himself an agnostic. But then he went on to say that he does not care." She raised her eyes politely at me. "No? More important things." She touched the small spoon in the saucer beside her cup. "I should have thought nothing was more important." "Then one's attitude to what one will never know? It seems to me a waste of time." I felt for her foot, but it had disappeared. She leaned forward and picked up the box of matches I had left on the table between us and shook out a dozen matchsticks on the white cloth. "Perhaps you're afraid to think about God?" She was not being natural, and I realized that this was some kind of prearranged scene. She was saying what Conchis wanted. "One can't think about what cannot be known." "You never think about tomorrow? About next year?" "Of course, I can make reasonable prophecies about them." She played with the matches, pushing them idly into patterns with her fingers. I watched her mouth, wished I could end the cold dialogue. "I can make reasonable prophecies about God." "Such as?" "He is very intelligent." "How do you know that?" "Because I don't understand him. Why he is, who he is, or how he is. And Maurice tells me I am quite intelligent. I think God must be very intelligent to be so much more intelligent than I am, to give me no clues, no certainties, no sights, no reasons, no motives." She stared briefly up at me from her matches. Her eyes had a kind of dry query that I recognized from Conchis. "Very intelligent or very unkind?" "Very wise. If I prayed, I'd ask God never to reveal himself to me, because if he did, I should know that he was not God, but a liar." Now she glanced at Conchis, who was facing out to sea, waiting for her, I thought, to finish her part of the act. But then I saw her forefinger slightly tap the table twice. Her eyes flicked sideways again at Conchis and then back to me. I looked down. She had hid them. X11. She avoided my suddenly comprehending eyes, and then, pushing the matchsticks into a little heap, she leant back out of the pool of light from the lamp and turned to Conchis. "You're very silent, Maurice. Am I right?" "I sympathize with you, Nicholas." He smiled at me. "I felt very much as you do when I was older and more experienced than you are. Neither of us has the intuitive humanity of womankind, so we are not to blame. He said it quite without gallantry, as a simple statement. Julie would not meet my eyes. Her face was in shadow, but then I had an experience that led me to understand what Julie has just said to you. Just then she paid us the compliment of making God male. But I think she knows, as all true women do, that all profound definitions of God are essentially definitions of the mother, of giving things, sometimes the strangest gifts, because the religious instinct is really the instinct to define whatever gives each situation. He settled back in his chair. I think I told you that when modern history, because the chauffeur stood for democracy, equality, progress, struck Descartes down in 1922, I was abroad. I was, in fact, in the remote north of Norway, in pursuit of birds, or to be more exact, bird sounds. You know perhaps that countless rare birds breed up there on the Arctic tundra. I am lucky. I have perfect pitch. I had by that time published 1 or 2 papers on the problems of accurately notating birds' cries and songs. I had even begun a small scientific correspondence with men like Dr. Van Oort of Leiden, the American A. A. Saunders, the Alexanders in England. So in the summer of 1922, I left Paris for 3 months in the Arctic. Julie shifted slightly, and I felt another small pressure on my foot, a very soft, naked pressure. I was wearing sandals myself, and without distracting Conchis, I forced the heel of the left one against the ground until I was free of it, then felt a bare sole slide gently down the side of my own naked foot. Her toes curled and brushed the top of mine. It was innocent, but erotic. I tried to get my foot on top of hers, but this time the pressure was reproving. We could stay in contact, but no more. Meanwhile, Conchis had gone on. On my way north, a professor at Oslo University told me of an educated farmer who lived in the heart of the vast fir forests that run from Norway and Finland into Russia. It seemed this man had some knowledge of birds. He sent migration records to my professor, who had never actually met him. The fir forest had several rare species I wanted to hear, so I decided to visit this farmer. As soon as I had ornithologically exhausted the tundra of the extreme north, I crossed the Varangafjord and went to the little town of Kirkenes. From there, armed with my letter of introduction, I set out for Seidavar. It took me 4 days to cover 90 miles. There was a road through the forest for the first 20, but after that I had to travel by rowing boat from isolated farm to farm along the river Pasvik. Endless forest, huge dark firs for mile after mile after mile. The river as broad and silent as a lake in a fairy tale, like a mirror unlooked in since time began. On the 4th day, 2 men rowed me all day, and we did not pass a single farm or see a single sign of man, only the silver-blue sheen of the endless river, the endless trees. Toward evening, we came in sight of a house and a clearing, 2 small meadows carpeted with buttercups, like slabs of gold in the somber forest. We had arrived at Seidavar. 3 buildings stood facing each other. There was a small wooden farmhouse by the water's edge, half hidden among a grove of silver birches, then a long turf-roofed barn, and a storehouse built on stilts to keep the rats out. A boat lay moored to a post by the house, and there were fishing nets hung out to dry. The farmer was a smallish man with quick brown eyes, about 50 years old, I suppose. I jumped ashore, and he read my letter. A woman some 5 years younger appeared and stood behind him. She had a severe but striking face, and although I could not understand what she and the farmer were saying, I knew she did not want me to stay there. I noticed she ignored the 2 boatmen, and they, in their turn, gave her curious looks, as if she was as much a stranger to them as myself. Very soon she went back indoors. However, the farmer bade me welcome. and I had been told he spoke halting but quite good English. I asked him where he had learned it, and he said that as a young man he had trained as a veterinary surgeon and had studied for a year in London. This made me look at him again. I could not imagine how he had ended up in that remotest corner of Europe. The woman was not, as I expected, his wife, but his sister-in-law. She had 2 children, both in their late adolescence. Neither the children nor their mother spoke any English, and without being rude, she made it silently clear to me that I was there against her choice. But Gustav Nygaard and I took to each other on sight. He showed me his books on birds, his notebooks. He was an enthusiast. I was an enthusiast. Of course, one of the early questions I asked concerned his brother. Nygaard seemed embarrassed. He said he had gone away. Then, as if to explain and to stop any further questions, he said, "Many years ago." The farmhouse was very small, and a space was cleared in the hayloft above the barn for my camp bed. I took my meals with the family. Nygaard talked only with me. His sister-in-law remained silent. Her chlorotic daughter the same. I think the inhibited boy would have liked to join in, but his uncle could rarely be bothered to translate what we said. Those first days, none of this little Norwegian domestic situation seemed important to me because the beauty of the place and the extraordinary richness of its bird life overwhelmed me. I spent each day looking and listening to the rare duck and geese, the divers, the wild swans that abounded in all the inlets and lagoons along the shore. It was a place where nature was triumphant over man. Not savagely triumphant, as one may feel in the tropics, but calmly, nobly triumphant. It is sentimental to talk of a landscape having a soul, but that one possessed a stronger character than any other I have seen, before or since. It ignored man. Man was nothing in it. It was not so bleak that he could not survive in it. The river was full of salmon and other fish, and the summer was long and warm enough to grow potatoes and a crop of hay, but so vast that he could not equal or tame it. I make it sound forbidding, perhaps, however, from being rather frightened by the solitude when I first arrived at the farm, I realized in 2 or 3 days that I had fallen in love with it. Above all, with its silences. The evenings, such peace. Sounds like the splash of a duck landing on the water. The scream of an osprey came across miles with a clarity that was first incredible, and then mysterious because, like a cry in an empty house, it seemed to make the silence, the peace, more intense, almost as if sounds were there to distinguish the silence and not the reverse. I think it was on the 3rd day that I discovered their secret. The very first morning, Nygaard had pointed out a long tree-covered spit of land that ran into the river some half a mile south of the farm, and asked me not to go on it. He said he had hung many nesting boxes there, and started a thriving colony of smew and goldeneye, and he did not want them disturbed. Of course I agreed, though it seemed late, even at that latitude, for duck to be sitting their eggs. I then noticed that when we had our evening meal, we were never all present. On the first evening, the girl was away. On the second, the boy appeared only when we had finished, even though I had seen him sitting gloomily by the shore only a few minutes before Nygaard came and called me to eat. The 3rd day, it so happened that I came back late myself to the farm. As I was walking back through the firs some way inland, I stopped to watch a bird. I did not mean to hide, but I was hidden. Conchis paused, and I remembered how he had been standing 2 weeks before, when I left Julie, like a pre-echo of this. Suddenly, about 200 yards away, I saw the girl going through the trees by the shore. In one hand she held a pail covered with a cloth, in the other a milk can. I remained behind a tree and watched her walk on. To my surprise, she followed the shore, and went on to the forbidden promontory. I watched her through glasses until I saw her disappear. Nygaard disliked having to sit in the same room with both his relations and myself. Their disapproving silence irked him, so he took to coming with me when I went to my bedroom in the barn to smoke a pipe and talk. That evening I told him I had seen his niece carrying what must have been food and drink on to the point. I asked him who was living there. He made no effort to hide the truth. The fact was this: his brother was living there, and he was insane. I glanced from Conchis to Julie and back, but neither of them showed any sign of noticing the oddness of this weaving of the past and the alleged present. I pressed against her foot. She returned the touch, but then moved her foot away. The story caught her. She was not to be distracted. I asked at once if a doctor had ever seen him. Nygaard shook his head as if his opinion of doctors, at least in this case, was not very high. I reminded him that I was a doctor myself. After a silence, he said, "I think we are all insane here." He got up then and went out. However, it was only to return a few minutes later. He had fetched a small sack. He shook its contents out of my camp bed. I saw a litter of rounded stones and flints, of shards of primitive pottery with bands of incised ornament, and I knew I was looking at a collection of Stone Age articles. I asked him where he had found them. He said, at Saidavar, and he then explained that the farm took its name from the point of land. That Saidavar was a Lap name and meant Hill of the Holy Stone, the Dolmen. The spit had once been a holy place for the Polmak Laps, who combine a fisher culture with the reindeer herding one. But even they had only superseded far earlier cultures. Originally, the farm had been no more than a summer dacha, a hunting and fishing lodge built by his father, an eccentric priest, who, by a fortunate marriage, had got enough money to indulge his multiple interests. A fierce old Lutheran pastor in one aspect, an upholder of the traditional Norwegian ways of rural life in another, a natural historian, and scholar of some local eminence, and a fanatical lover of hunting and fishing, of returning to the wild. Both his sons had, at least in youth, revolted against his religious side. Henrik the elder had gone to sea, a ship's engineer. Gustav had taken to veterinary work. The father had died and left almost all his money to the church. While staying with Gustav, who had by then begun to practice in Trondheim, Henrik met Ragna and married her. I think he went to sea again for a short time, but very soon after his marriage he went through a nervous crisis, gave up his career, and retired to Saidavar. All went well for a year or two, but then his behavior grew stranger and stranger. Finally, Ragna wrote Gustav a letter. What it said made him catch the next boat north. He found that for nearly 9 months she had managed the farm single-handed. What is more, with 2 babies to look after. He returned briefly to Trondheim to clear up his affairs, and from then on assumed the responsibility of the farm and his brother's family. He said, "I had no choice." I had already suspected it in the strain between them. He was, or had been, in love with Ragna. Now they were locked together more tightly than love can ever lock, in a state of total unrequitedness on his side, and one of total fidelity on hers. I wanted to know what form the brothers' madness had taken, and then, nodding at the stones, Gustav went back to Saidavar. To begin with, his brother had taken to going there for short periods to meditate. Then he had become convinced that one day he, or at any rate the place, was to be visited by God. For 12 years he had lived as a hermit, waiting for this visit. He never returned to the farm. Barely 100 words had passed between the brothers those last 2 years. Ragna never went near him. He was, of course, dependent for all his needs on them, especially since, By a surcroît de malheur, he was almost blind. Gustav believed that he no longer fully realized what they did for him. He took it as a manna fallen from heaven, without question or human gratitude. I asked Gustav when he had last spoken to his brother. Remember, we were then at the beginning of August, and he said shamefacedly, but with a hopeless shrug, "In May." I've now found myself more interested in the 4 people at the farm than in my birds. I looked at Ragna again and thought I saw in her a tragic dimension. She had fine eyes, Euripidean eyes, as hard and dark as obsidian. I felt sorry for the children, too, brought up like bacilli in a test tube, on a culture of such pure Strindbergian melancholia. Never to be able to escape the situation, to have no neighbors within 20 miles, no village within 50. I realized why Gustav had welcomed my arrival. In a way, he had kept his sanity, his sense of perspective. His insanity, of course, lay in his doomed love for his sister-in-law. Like all young men, I saw myself as a catalyst, as a solver of situations, and I had my medical training, my knowledge of the still then not ubiquitously familiar gentleman from Vienna. I recognized Hendrick's syndrome at once. It was a textbook example of anal overtraining, with an obsessive father identification, the whole exacerbated by the solitude in which they lived. It seemed as clear to me as the behavior of the birds I watched every day. Now that the secret was revealed, Gustav was not unreluctant to talk, and the next evening he told me more, which confirmed my diagnosis. It seemed Henrik had always loved the sea. This was why he had studied engineering, but gradually he realized that he did not like machinery, and he did not like other men. It began with mesomechanism. The misanthropism took longer to develop, and his marriage was probably at least partly an attempt to prevent its development. He had always loved space, solitude. That is why he loved the sea, and no doubt why he came to hate being cramped aboard a ship, in the grease and clangor of an engine room. If he could have sailed round the world alone, but instead he came to live at Saidavar, where the land was like the sea. His children were born, and then his eyesight began to fail. He knocked glasses over at table, stumbled over roots in the forest. His mania began. Henrik was a Jansenist. He believed in a divine cruelty. In his system he was elect, especially chosen to be punished and tormented, to sweat out his youth in bad ships, in filthy climates, so that his reward, his paradise, should be snatched out of his hands when he came to enjoy it. He could not see the objective truth, that destiny is hazard. Nothing is unjust to all, though many things may be unjust to each. This sense of God's injustice smoldered in him. He refused to go to hospital to have his eyes looked at. He became red-hot for lack of the oil of objectivity, and so his soul both burnt in him and burnt him. He did not go to Saidavar to meditate, but to hate. Needless to say, I was eager to have a look at this religious maniac, and not altogether out of medical curiosity, because I had grown to like Gustav very much. I even tried to explain to him what psychiatry was, but he seemed uninterested. It is best left alone, was all he said. I promised him still to avoid the promontory, and there the matter was left. One windy day soon after, I had gone 3 or 4 miles south along the river when I heard someone calling my name. It was Gustav in his boat. I stood out from the trees, and he rowed toward me. I thought he had been netting grayling, but he had come to find me. He wanted me, after all, to look at his brother. We were to remain hidden, to stalk and watch Henrik like a bird. Gustav explained that it was the right day. Like many afflicted with near blindness, his brother had developed very sharp hearing, and so the wind was in our favor. I got into the boat and we rowed to a little beach near the end of the point. Gustav disappeared and then came back. He said Henrik was waiting near the Sida, the Lapp dolmen. It was safe for us to visit his hut. We made our way through the trees up a small slope, passed over to the southern side, and there where the trees were thickest, in a depression, was a curious cabin. It had been sunk into the ground so that only the turf roof showed on 3 sides. On the fourth, where the ground fell away, there was a door and a small window. A stack of wood lay beside the house, but no other sign of any employment. Gustav made me go in while he stayed on watch outside. It was very dark, as bare as a monastic cell. A truckle bed, a rough table, a tin with a bundle of candles. The only concession to comfort, an old stove. There was no carpet, no curtain. The lived-in parts of the room were fairly clean, but the corners were full of refuse. Old leaves, dirt, spiders' webs, an odor of unwashed clothes. There was one book on the table by the one small window, a huge black Bible with enormous print. Beside it, a magnifying glass, pools of candle wax. I lit one of the candles to look at the ceiling. 5 or 6 beams that supported the roof had been scraped pale, and along them had been carved 2 long brown-lettered texts from the Bible. They were in Norwegian, of course, but I noted down the references. And on a crossbeam facing the door, there was another sentence in Norwegian. When I came out into the sunlight again, I asked Gustav what the Norwegian sentence meant. He said, Henrik Nygaard, cursed by God, wrote us in his own blood in the year 1912. That was 10 years before. Now I will read you the other 2 texts he had cut and then stained in with blood. Conchis opened the book beside him. One was from Exodus. They encamped in the edge of the wilderness, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud, and by night in a pillar of fire. The other was an echo of the same text in the Apocrypha, here from Esdras. I gave you light in a pillar of fire, yet have you forgotten me, saith the Lord. These texts reminded me of Montaigne. You know, he had 42 proverbs and quotations painted across the beams of his study roof. But there was none of the sanity of Montaigne in Henrik. Both the intensity of Pascal's famous Memorial, those 2 crucial hours in his life that he could afterwards describe only by one word, feu. Sometimes rooms seem to imbibe the spirit of the people who have lived in them. Think of Savonarola's cell in Florence. And this was such a place. One did not have to know the occupant's past. The suffering, the agony, the mental sickness were as palpable as tumors. I left the cabin and we went cautiously toward the Sida. It came in sight through the trees. It was not a true dolmen, but simply a tall boulder that wind and frost had weathered into a picturesque shape. Gustav pointed. Some 50 yards away, on the far side of a clump of birches, hidden from the Sida, stood a man. I focused my glasses on him. He was taller than Gustav, a thin man with rough-cut, dark gray hair and beard, and an aquiline nose. He turned by chance and faced us, and I had a full view of his gaunt face. What surprised me was its fierceness, a severity that was almost savagery. I had never seen a face that expressed such violent determination, never to compromise, never to deviate, never to smile. And what eyes! They were slightly exophthalmic, of the most startling cold blue. Beyond any doubt, insane eyes. Even at 50 yards I could see that. He wore an old indigo lap smock with faded red braid round its edges, dark trousers, and heavy snout-ended lap boots, and in his hand he held a staff. I watched this rare specimen of humanity for some time. I had expected to see some furtive creature, someone who mumbled to himself as he crept through the trees, not this fierce-blinded hawk of a man. Gustav nudged my arm again. The nephew appeared by the side with a bucket and the milk can. He put them down, picked up another bucket that must have been set there by Henrik, looked round, and then cried something in Norwegian, not very loud. He evidently knew where his father was, for he faced the clump of birches. Then he disappeared back through the trees. After 5 minutes, Henrik began to walk up toward the side, quite confidently, but feeling his way with the end of the staff. He picked up the bucket and can, placing the staff under his arm, and then started back along the familiar path to his cabin. The path brought him within 20 yards of the birch scrub behind which we were standing. Just as he passed us, I heard high overhead one of the frequent sounds of the river, a very beautiful one, like the calling of Tutankhamun's trumpets, the flight cry of a black-throated diver. Henrik stopped, although the sound must have been as banal to him as the wind in the trees. He stood there, his face turned upward toward the sky, without emotion, without despair, but listening, waiting, as if it might be the first few notes of the herald angels telling him the great visit was near. He went on out of sight, and I returned to the farmstead with Gustav. I did not know what to say. I did not like to disappoint him, to admit defeat. I had my own foolish pride. After all, I was a founder member of the Society of Reason. In the end, I concocted a plan. I would visit Henrik alone. I would tell him I was a doctor and that I would like to look at his eyes. And while I looked at his eyes, I would try to look at his mind. I arrived outside of Henrik's hut at midday the next morning. It was raining slightly, a gray day. I knocked on the cabin door and stood back a few steps. There was a long pause. Then he appeared, dressed exactly as he had been the evening before. Face to face and close to him, I was struck more than ever by his fierceness. It was very difficult to believe that he was nearly blind, because his eyes had such a pale, staring blueness. But now I was close to him, I could see that it was a poorly focused stare, and I could see also the characteristic opacity of cataract in both eyes. He must have been very shocked, but he gave no sign of it. I asked him if he understood English. I knew from Gustav that he in fact did, but I wanted him to answer. All he did was to raise his staff, as if to keep me at bay. It was a warning rather than a threatening gesture. So I took it to mean that I could go on, provided that I kept my distance. I explained that I was a doctor, that I was interested in birds. I had come to Saidavar to study them, and so on. I spoke very slowly, remembering that he could not have heard the language for 15 years or more. He listened to me without expression. I began to talk about modern methods of treatment for cataract. I am sure that a hospital could do something for him. All the time, not a single word. At last I fell silent. He turned and went back into the hut. He left the door open, so I waited. Suddenly he appeared again. In his hand he held what I held, Nicholas, when I came on you this afternoon, a long axe. But I knew at once that he was no more thinking of chopping wood than a berserk about to enter battle. He hesitated a moment, then rushed at me, swinging the axe up as he ran. If he had not been nearly blind, he would, beyond any doubt, have killed me. As it was, I sprang back only just in time. The axe head went deep into the soil. The 2 moments he took to jerk it free gave me the time to run. He came stumbling after me across the little clearing in front of the hut. I ran some 30 yards into the trees, but he stopped by the first one. At 20 feet, he probably could not have told me from a tree trunk. He stood with the axe poised in his hands, listening, straining his eyes. He must have known I was watching him, for without warning he turned and swung the axe with all his strength into a silver birch just in front of him. It was a fair-sized tree, but it shook from top to bottom with the blow, and that was his answer. I was too frightened by the violence of the man to move. He stared a moment into the trees where I stood, and then turned and walked into the hut, leaving the axe where it had struck. I went back to the farmstead, a wiser young man. It seemed incredible to me that a man should reject medicine, reason, science so violently, but I felt that this man would have rejected everything else about me as well as if he had known it. The pursuit of pleasure, of music, of reason, of medicine. That axe would have driven right through the skull of all our pleasure-oriented civilization. Our science, our psychoanalysis. To him, all that was not the great meeting was what the Buddhists call leelas, the futile pursuit of triviality. And of course, to have been concerned about his blindness would have been for him more futility. He wanted to be blind. It made it more likely that one day he would see. Some days afterwards I was due to leave. On my last evening, Gustav kept me talking very late. I had said nothing to him of my visit. It was a windless night, but in August up there it begins to get cold. I went out of the barn to urinate when Gustav left. There was a brilliant moon, but in one of those late summer skies of the extreme north, when day lingers even in the darkness, and the sky has strange depths. Nights when new worlds seem always about to begin. I heard from across the water, from Saidavar, a cry. For a moment I thought it must be some bird, but then I knew it could only be Henrik. I looked toward the farmstead. I could see Gustav had stopped, was standing outside, listening. Another cry came. It was dragged out, the cry of someone who is calling a great distance. I walked across the grass to Gustav. "Is he in trouble?" I asked. He shook his head, and remained staring out at the dark shadow of Saidavar across the moon-gray water. "What was he calling?" Gustav said, "Do you hear me? I am here." And then the two cries with an interval between came again, and I could make out the Norwegian words. "Hører du mich? Jeg er her." Henrik was calling to God. I told you how sounds carried at Saidavar. Each time he called, the cry seemed to stretch out infinitely, through the forest, over the water, into the stars. Then there were receding echoes, one or two shrill cries from distant disturbed birds. There was a noise from the farmstead behind us. I looked up and saw a white figure at one of the upper windows, whether Ragna or her daughter I could not see. It was as if we were all under a spell. To break it, I began to question Gustav. Did he often call like this? He said not often, 3 or 4 times a year, when there was no wind and a full moon. Did he ever cry other phrases? Gustav thought back. Yes. "I am waiting" was one. "I am purified" another. "I am prepared" another. But the 2 phrases we had heard were the ones he used most. I turned to Gustav and asked him if we could go on again and see what Henrik was doing. Without answering, he nodded, and we set off. It took us some 10 or 15 minutes to get to the base of the point. Every so often we heard the cries. We came to the Saida, but the cries were still some way off. Gustav said, "He is at the end." We passed the cabin, and walking as quietly as we could, made our way to the end of the point. At last we came through the trees. Beyond them there ran out a beach, some 30 or 40 yards of shingle. The river narrowed a little, and the point took the force of what current there was. Even on a night as calm as that, there was a murmur over the shallow stones. Henrik was standing at the very tip of the shingle spit in about a foot of water. He was facing out to the northeast, where the river widened. The moonlight covered it in a gray satin sheen. Out in midstream there were long, low banks of mist. As we watched, he called, "Hörer du mich?" with great force, as if to someone several miles away on the invisible far bank. A long pause, then, Jäger Herr! I trained my glasses on him. He was standing, legs astride, his staff in his hand, biblically. There was silence, a black silhouette in the glittering current. Then we heard Henrik say one word, much more quietly. It was, "Tak," the Norwegian for thanks. I watched him. He stepped back a pace or two out of the water and knelt on the shingle. We heard the sounds of the stones as he moved. He still faced the same way, his hands by his side. It was not an attitude of prayer, but a watching on his knees. Something was very close to him, as visible to him as Gustav's dark head, the trees, the moonlight on the leaves around us was to me. I would have given 10 years of my life to have been able to look out there to the north, from inside his mind. I did not know what he was seeing, but I knew it was something of such power, such mystery, that it explained all. And of course, Henrik's secret dawned on me, almost like some reflection of the illumination that shone over him. He was not waiting to meet God. He was meeting God, and had been meeting him probably for many years. He was not waiting up for some certainty. He lived in it. Up to this point in my life, you will have realized that my whole approach was scientific, medical, classifying. I was conditioned by a kind of ornithological approach to man. I thought in terms of species, behaviors, observations. Here, for the first time in my life, I was unsure of my standards, my beliefs, my prejudices. I knew the man out there on the point was having an experience beyond the scope of all my science and all my reason, and I knew that my science and reason would always be defective until they could comprehend what was happening in Henrik's mind. I knew that Henrik was seeing a pillar of fire out there over the water. I knew that there was no pillar of fire there, that it could be demonstrated that the only pillar of fire was in Henrik's mind. But in a flash, as of lightning, all our explanations, all our classifications and derivations, our etiologies, suddenly appeared to me like a thin net. That great passive monster reality was no longer dead, easy to handle. It was full of a mysterious vigor, new forms, new possibilities. The net was nothing. Reality burst through it. Perhaps something telepathic passed between Henrik and myself. I do not know. That simple phrase, I do not know, was my own pillar of fire for me too. It revealed a world beyond that in which I lived. For me too it brought a new humility akin to fierceness. For me too, a profound mystery. For me too, a sense of the vanity of so many things our age considers important. I do not say I should not have arrived at such an insight one day, but in that night I bridged a dozen years. Whatever else, I know that. In a short time we saw Henrik walk back into the trees. I could not see his face, but I think the fierceness it wore in daylight was the fierceness that came from his contact with the pillar of fire. Perhaps for him the pillar of fire was no longer enough, and in that sense he was still waiting to meet God. Living is an eternal wanting more, in the coarsest grocer and in the sublimest mystic. But of one thing I am certain, if he still lacked God, he had the Holy Spirit. The next day I left. I said goodbye to Ragna. There was no lessening of her hostility. I think that unlike Gustav, she had divined her husband's secret, that any attempt to cure him would kill him. Gustav and his nephew rode me the 20 miles north to the next farm. We shook hands. We promised to write. I could offer no consolation, and I do not think he wanted any. There are situations in which consolation only threatens the equilibrium that time has instituted. And so I returned to France.